The timber bundle crashed to the ground with a sound that echoed through the pine-studded canyon, and Gideon Sutherland froze mid-swing with his axe buried deep in a ponderosa trunk, watching the slender woman crumple to her knees beside the scattered wood. Her shoulders heaved with exhaustion beneath a threadbare shawl that did nothing against the October wind sweeping down from the Medicine Bow Mountains, and something in his chest twisted hard at the sight of her struggling to gather the logs with trembling hands. He had been watching her for 3 days now from his camp higher up the mountain. This stubborn woman who made the daily trek from her homestead cabin to collect firewood, always alone, always carrying more than she should. Gideon had lived in these Wyoming mountains since 1873. 5 years of solitude after the war had hollowed him out and left him seeking silence, and he had learned to mind his own business where other settlers were concerned. But this was different. This was a woman barely surviving, and winter in Wheatland came early and stayed late, bringing temperatures that could kill as surely as any bullet. He pulled his axe free and started down the slope, his boots finding purchase on the rocky terrain with the practiced ease of a man who belonged to the wilderness. His long, dark hair, streaked with premature silver at 32, fell past his shoulders, and his buckskin shirt stretched across the broad plains of his chest and shoulders, muscles honed by years of splitting wood and hauling game. She heard him coming and spun around, her eyes wide with alarm. They were the color of amber in sunlight, set in a face that might have been beautiful if it was not drawn tight with hunger and fatigue. She could not have been more than 23 or 24, and the dress she wore hung loose on her frame, telling him she had been skipping meals. Her dark blonde hair had escaped its pins and tumbled around her face in waves. "Stay back," she said, and her voice shook only slightly. She had picked up a sturdy piece of firewood and held it like a club, which would have been amusing if the situation was not so dire. Gideon stopped a respectful distance away and held up his free hand, keeping the axe low at his side. "I am not here to cause you trouble, miss. I saw you fall and thought you might need help. I do not need anything from you or anyone else." Her chin lifted with pride that had no business showing itself when she was clearly one bad day away from disaster. "I can manage just fine. I can see that." He glanced at the scattered firewood, then at the makeshift sling she had fashioned from rope and canvas to drag it home. "That is a fair load you are hauling. It is my load to haul." She lowered the wood slightly but did not drop it. "I have seen you watching from up the mountain. What do you want?" So she had noticed him. Gideon felt an unexpected flush of something that might have been embarrassment if he was the type to embarrass easily. "I live up there," he said, nodding toward the higher elevations. "I watch everything that moves through this valley. Habit from the war." Her expression softened slightly at that. "You fought for the Union. You." "My husband fought for the Union too." She said it in past tense, and Gideon understood immediately. "He died at Cold Harbor in '64. I was barely 19. I am sorry." The words felt inadequate as they always did, but he meant them. Cold Harbor had been a slaughter, one of many that year. "You have been alone since then." "I remarried 2 years ago." Her voice went flat. "He died last spring when his horse threw him and broke his neck. So yes, I am alone again." She finally lowered the wood completely and straightened, brushing dirt from her skirts with shaking hands. "I am Theresa Montgomery. I have the homestead about 2 miles west of here. Gideon Sutherland." He moved slowly toward the firewood and began gathering it, noting how little there was. This would last her maybe 3 days if she was frugal with her fire. "You are going to need a lot more than this to make it through winter. I know that." There was a snap in her voice now, pride wounded. "I am working on it. At this rate, you will work yourself to death before you get enough." He started loading the wood into her sling with efficient movements. You have maybe 6 weeks before the first real snow hits. You need at least 3 cords stacked and dry, probably more. That is not accounting for cooking fuel. Theresa watched him with suspicion and something else, something that might have been desperate hope quickly suppressed. Why do you care? It was a fair question. Gideon straightened and looked at her directly, letting her see that he meant no harm. Because I have watched too many people die when they did not have to. Because I can help and it would cost me nothing but time and sweat. Because you remind me of someone. That last part slipped out unbidden and he saw her eyes narrow. Who, my sister? She had your same stubborn streak. Died of pneumonia in '66 because she would not admit she needed help until it was too late. The memory still stung, even after 12 years. I swore after that I would not stand by again when I could do something. Theresa was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those amber eyes that seemed to see right through his careful defenses. Finally, she nodded once, a small sharp movement. I cannot pay you, I have almost nothing. The cattle died over the summer from some sickness, and my chickens were taken by foxes. I have a small garden, but most of it failed. I can offer you meals, but they will not be much. I do not want payment. Gideon finished loading the wood and looked around the clearing. Where is your axe? It broke 3 days ago. The head came off the handle. She said it matter-of-factly, but he could see the despair lurking beneath the words. An axe was survival in this country, and a good one cost money she clearly did not have. He made a decision then that would change both their lives, though he did not know it yet. All right, here is what we are going to do. I am going to come down to your homestead tomorrow morning, and I am going to spend the next few weeks cutting and stacking enough firewood to last you through winter. I will bring my own food, and I will camp nearby, so you do not have to worry about propriety. When I am done, I will leave, and you can get through to spring. Why would you do that? She looked genuinely baffled, and that told him more about her life than any words could. How long had it been since someone helped her without wanting something in return? Because it is the right thing to do. He picked up the rope attached to her sling. Come on, I will help you get this home, and you can show me where you want the wood stacked. They walked in silence through the pines, the altitude making the air thin and crisp. The sun was starting its descent toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Theresa led him down a narrow path that wound between rocky outcroppings and stands of aspen just beginning to turn yellow. Her homestead, when they reached it, was smaller than he had expected but well maintained given her circumstances. The cabin was solidly built with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. There was a barn that had seen better days, a chicken coop sitting empty, and a garden plot that showed signs of having been carefully tended even if the harvest had been poor. My second husband built the cabin, Theresa said, following his gaze. Henry Montgomery. He was a good man, a hard worker. He had plans to expand, to build up a real ranch here. She gestured vaguely at the surrounding land. 240 acres under the Homestead Act. We were going to make something of it. You still can. Gideon set down the wood near the porch and looked around with a practiced eye. The land is good. You have water. He could hear a creek babbling somewhere nearby. Spring Creek runs along the north boundary, never runs dry, even in summer. She climbed the porch steps and turned to face him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of real hope in her expression. You really think I could make it work? With enough wood to keep you warm and alive through winter, yes. Spring will give you a fresh start. He paused, then added carefully, you might consider getting some help for the heavy work, maybe hire a hand for spring planting. With what money? But she said it without bitterness, just stating a fact. I will figure something out, I always do. Gideon believed her. This was a woman who had survived 2 husbands dead before she was 25, who was facing down winter alone in the mountains and refusing to break. He found himself wanting to know more about her, wanting to understand what forged someone with that kind of steel in their spine. But the sun was getting low, and he needed to get back to his camp before dark. "I will be here tomorrow at first light," he said. "Have coffee ready if you have it." "I have coffee." A small smile touched her lips, the first he had seen. "It might be the only thing I do have besides dried beans and some flour. Coffee is enough." He left her standing on the porch and made his way back up the mountain as darkness fell. His camp was a comfortable setup he had perfected over 5 years. A lean-to shelter with a fire pit, and his supplies carefully stored against animals and weather. He had traps set along the creek that usually provided him with rabbit or the occasional beaver, and he kept a store of dried venison and fish that would last him well into winter. His life was simple, solitary, and exactly what he had thought he wanted after the war. But as he sat by his fire that night, cooking a rabbit over the flames, he could not stop thinking about Theresa Montgomery, about the exhaustion in her eyes and the determination in her voice, about the way she had held that piece of firewood like a weapon, ready to defend herself even though she was clearly at the end of her strength. Something about her called to the protective instincts he had thought died with his sister, and he found himself already planning how to get the wood cut and stacked as efficiently as possible. He was up before dawn, packing his axe and a saw, some tools for splitting, and a whetstone. He debated bringing some of his dried meat, then added it to his pack anyway. If she was living on beans and flour, she needed protein. He could always trap more game. The walk down to her homestead took less time in the growing light, and he could smell coffee brewing before he could see the cabin. Theresa was already up, sitting on the porch steps with a tin cup cradled in her hands. She had changed into a different dress, this one slightly less worn, and had pinned her hair back in a practical bun. "You came," she said, and he heard the relief in her voice. She had not been sure he would. "I said I would." He climbed the steps and accepted the cup of coffee she poured from a battered pot. It was strong and bitter and perfect. "Where do you want the woodpile?" She showed him a spot near the cabin, sheltered by the overhang of the porch roof, and close enough to the door that she could reach it even in deep snow. There was already a small stack there, maybe a quarter cord of wood that she had managed to gather on her own. Gideon set down his pack and began unloading his tools, aware of her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "I brought some dried venison," he said, pulling out the wrapped bundle. "Figured you could use it. I told you I cannot pay you. And I told you I do not want payment." He held out the bundle until she took it, her fingers brushing his briefly. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, and he saw her eyes widen slightly. She felt it too. "Just let me help, Theresa." Hearing him use her name seemed to decide something for her. She nodded and clutched the venison to her chest. "Thank you, truly. I will make us something for lunch." "That sounds good." He spent the rest of the morning identifying the best trees to cut, marking out a section of forest that needed thinning anyway. The work was hard and familiar, the axe swinging in a steady rhythm that let his mind go quiet. This was what he had come to the mountains for, this physical simplicity that demanded nothing but strength and focus. But now there was an added element, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his solitary existence. He was helping someone, making a real difference, and it felt good in a way that surprised him. Theresa brought him water at mid-morning, appearing silently between the trees with a bucket and a dipper. She had been watching him work, he realized, studying the play of muscles across his shoulders and back as he swung the axe. When he turned to take the water, he saw the faint blush on her cheeks, and understood that she was noticing him as a man, not just as help. The knowledge sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. "You are good at this," she said, gesturing at the tree he had just felled with precise, angled cuts that left it lying exactly where he wanted it. "I have had a lot of practice." He drank deeply, then poured some of the cold water over his head and neck. When he looked up, she was staring at him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "What? Nothing. I just—" She trailed off, then shook her head. "I was just thinking that I had forgotten what it is like to have someone help, to not have to do everything alone." "You have been alone too long." The words came out rougher than he intended, and he saw her straighten slightly, that defensive pride flickering to life again. "I manage." "I know you do, but managing and living are not the same thing." He set down the dipper and picked up his axe again. "You should not have to just manage." She did not answer, but when she walked back to the cabin, her steps were slower, thoughtful. Gideon returned to his work, felling another tree and starting the process of limbing it. By the time Theresa called him for lunch, he had 2 good-sized pines down and was working on a third. He was covered in sweat and bark, his muscles singing with the good ache of hard work, and he felt more alive than he had in months. Lunch was simple but better than he expected. She had used some of the dried venison to make a stew with beans and wild onions, and she served it with biscuits that were surprisingly good given her limited supplies. They ate on the porch, watching the clouds build over the mountains, and talked in the careful way of 2 people learning to trust each other. She told him about her first husband, a sweet boy from her hometown in Illinois who had marched off to war filled with idealism and never came home. About how she had tried to make a life for herself afterward, but had felt so lost and alone that when Theresa Montgomery proposed after a brief courtship, she had said yes just to have someone. "I did not love him," she admitted, staring into her cup. "Not at first. But I grew to care for him very much. He was kind and he worked hard and he treated me with respect. When he died, I grieved him truly. Not the same way I grieved Thomas, my first husband, but it was real. Grief is grief," Gideon said quietly. "It does not have to look the same to be valid." "Did you lose someone in the war? Besides your sister, I mean." He was quiet for a long moment, debating how much to share, but something about Theresa invited honesty. "I lost a lot of people, my whole company at one point. I was a sergeant and I gave orders that got good men killed. I did what I was told, followed the strategy from officers who were nowhere near the fighting, and I watched boys barely old enough to shave die screaming in the mud." He could still hear those screams sometimes at night. "When it was finally over, I could not go back to normal life. Could not pretend that everything was fine and that I should just pick up where I left off. So I came out here and I have been here ever since." "Do you ever get lonely?" Her voice was soft, understanding, all the time. He met her eyes and saw his own loneliness reflected back at him. "But lonely is better than being surrounded by people who will never understand what you saw, what you did. Out here, I do not have to pretend. I understand that." She reached across the small space between them and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of connection that hit him harder than any words could. "Thank you for telling me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, and Gideon felt something shifting between them, some invisible wall coming down brick by brick. He wanted to know everything about her, wanted to hear her voice and see her smile and understand what made her fight so hard to survive when it would have been easier to give up. But he also knew they had time, that this was not something to be rushed. So he finished his stew and thanked her for the meal and went back to cutting trees. The pattern continued for the next week. Gideon would arrive at dawn, work until mid-morning when Theresa brought him water. break for lunch on the porch where they talked about their lives and slowly learned each other, then work until dark before hiking back up to his camp. The pile of logs near the cabin grew steadily, and he taught Theresa how to use a splitting maul so she could help with processing the wood into manageable pieces. She was stronger than she looked, attacking the work with fierce determination, though he could see it exhausted her. "You need to eat more," he said one afternoon, watching her struggle with a particularly stubborn log. "You are burning more energy than you are taking in. I am eating what I have." But she did not argue when he started bringing more of his supplies down from camp, adding to her stores little by little. Dried fish, some wild mushrooms he had harvested and dried, even a small sack of cornmeal he had traded for at a settlement farther south. She accepted it all with quiet gratitude, and in return, she cooked meals that stretched his contributions into something more than the sum of their parts. He was splitting wood 2 weeks into the project when he heard her cry out. Gideon dropped the maul and ran toward the cabin, his heart hammering with sudden fear. He found her in the garden, staring at something on the ground with her hand pressed to her mouth. When he got closer, he saw it was a snake, a rattler coiled and ready to strike, positioned right where she would have stepped if she had not noticed it. "Do not move," he said quietly, already pulling his knife. He circled around behind the snake, moving with the careful grace of a hunter, and killed it with a single precise strike. The tension went out of Theresa all at once, and she swayed. Gideon was there instantly, catching her before she could fall, his arms coming around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. "I have you," he murmured, feeling her trembling against him. "You are safe." "I did not see it until I was almost on top of it." Her voice shook, reaction setting in. "If I had stepped there. But you did not." He turned her gently in his arms, needing to see her face, needing to assure himself that she was truly unharmed. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and something passed between them that had been building for days. He saw the exact moment she became aware of how close they were, how his hands were still on her waist, and how her palms were pressed flat against his chest. Her breath caught, and he felt his own breathing go shallow. "Gideon," she whispered, and it was both a question and an answer. He kissed her, could not stop himself from kissing her, from covering her mouth with his and tasting the gasp of surprise that became a soft sound of need. She melted into him, her arms sliding up around his neck, and for a handful of heartbeats, nothing existed except the two of them and the connection that flared bright as summer lightning. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and tried to remember all the reasons this was a bad idea. "I should not have done that," he said, even as his hands tightened on her waist, contradicting his words. "Why not?" She was looking at him with an openness that took his breath away. "I wanted you to. You barely know me. I know enough." Her fingers tangled in his hair, tugging gently. "I know you are kind and honorable, and that you came down from your mountain to help a stranger for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. I know you listen when I talk, and that you look at me like I matter. That is more than I have had in a long time, Gideon. Theresa." He said her name like a prayer and kissed her again, slower this time, savoring it. She responded with a passion that surprised him, opening to him completely, holding nothing back. When they finally separated, he was shaking with the effort of maintaining control. "I want you," he admitted roughly. "I have wanted you since the first day I saw you struggling with that firewood, but I will not take advantage of your situation." "You are not taking advantage." She touched his face with gentle fingers, tracing the line of his jaw. "I want this too. I want you. But I understand if you need time, if you need to be sure. I am sure." That was the problem. He was more sure of this of her than he had been of anything in years. But we should do this right. Court you properly, not just tumble me in the garden like some dime novel." She smiled, and it transformed her face, made her radiant. "I agree. I have been married twice, Gideon, and neither time did I have a proper courtship. I would like that if you are offering. I am offering." He kissed her forehead, then carefully stepped back, putting distance between them before he did something they might regret. Or more accurately, before he did something he would not regret at all. "Let me finish the wood first. Then we can talk about what comes next." "All right." She watched him collect the dead snake, which he gutted and cleaned efficiently. The meat would provide another meal, and the skin could be tanned and used. Nothing went to waste in this country. "Will you stay for dinner tonight? It will be dark soon anyway, and I do not like the idea of you hiking up the mountain in the dark after working all day." He should say no, should maintain proper boundaries. But he found himself nodding, and the smile she gave him in return was worth any risk to his carefully constructed solitude. They cooked the snake meat together in her small kitchen, moving around each other with an ease that felt natural, practiced, though this was the first time. She told him about her childhood in Illinois, about a father who had been a schoolteacher and a mother who had died when Theresa was 16. About younger siblings she had helped raise until she married Thomas and moved away. "You still see them?" Gideon asked, seasoning the meat with wild herbs she had dried. "I have not seen them since I came west with Henry." Sadness flickered across her face. "We exchange letters when we can, but it has been hard. They do not understand why I stayed after he died, why I did not come back to Illinois." "Why did you stay?" She was quiet for a moment, stirring the pot thoughtfully. "Because this is mine. This land, this cabin, the life I am trying to build. I lost Thomas to war and Henry to an accident, but I will not lose myself. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." He understood that desire for ownership, for something that was entirely yours. It was why he had claimed his mountain, why he had built his life in the wilderness. "You are a fighter, Theresa Montgomery." "I have to be." She ladled stew into bowls, and they sat at her small table, knees bumping in the confined space. "The world is not kind to women alone. I learned that after Thomas died. People either want to take advantage or they want to save you, and neither one sees you as a person. You are the first man who has treated me like an equal. You are an equal." He said it firmly, meaning it. "Stronger than most men I know, if I am being honest." They talked late into the night, the conversation flowing easily from serious to light-hearted and back again. Theresa told him stories about her disasters learning to live on a frontier homestead, about chickens that escaped and cows that refused to cooperate, and a garden that had flooded during a spring storm. Gideon told her about his first winter in the mountains, when he had nearly died of pneumonia, because he had been too stubborn to admit he needed to build a better shelter. They laughed together, the sound warm and intimate in the small cabin, and Gideon felt something in his chest that had been frozen since the war began to thaw. When he finally prepared to leave, long past midnight, Theresa walked him to the door. "Be safe going up the mountain," she said softly. "And come back tomorrow." "I will." He kissed her again, unable to resist, and felt her smile against his mouth. "Sleep well, Theresa. You too, Gideon." He hiked up the mountain by moonlight, his heart lighter than it had been in years, and dreamed of amber eyes and a smile that felt like coming home. The next few weeks passed in a haze of work and growing intimacy. Gideon cut and split wood with single-minded focus, determined to leave Theresa with more than enough to survive the winter. The woodpile grew to impressive proportions, stacked neatly against the cabin wall and covered with canvas to keep it dry. He repaired her chicken coop and built new nesting boxes. then disappeared for 2 days and returned with 4 hens and a rooster he had traded for at a settlement 30 miles away. Theresa's face when she saw the chickens was worth every mile he had walked. "Gideon, you did not have to do this," she protested, but she was already scattering feed and cooing over the birds. "Yes, I did." He leaned against the coop, watching her happiness with satisfaction. "You need eggs and eventually more chickens. These are good layers, and the rooster should keep them productive." She straightened and looked at him with an expression that made his pulse quicken. "You are a good man, Gideon Sutherland, better than I deserve. That is backward." He caught her hand and pulled her close, uncaring that they were standing in the yard in broad daylight. "You deserve everything good, Theresa. Everything." She kissed him then, rising on her toes to press her mouth to his, and he responded with the hunger that had been building for weeks. They had been careful to maintain propriety, to not cross certain lines, but the restraint was becoming harder with each passing day. He wanted her with an intensity that sometimes scared him, wanted to claim her and protect her and build a life with her. But he also wanted to do right by her, to give her the courtship and respect she deserved. "Stay with me tonight," she whispered against his lips. "Properly, I mean, I will make up a bed for you near the fire. I just want you clothes. Are you sure?" He searched her face, looking for doubt, but found only certainty. "I am sure." So he stayed, sleeping on a pallet near her fireplace while she slept in her bed, and it was both torture and perfection. He could hear her breathing in the darkness, could smell the faint scent of the lavender she used in her hair, and he lay awake for hours just listening and imagining. In the morning, she made them breakfast and they ate together as the sun rose, and it felt so domestic, so right, that Gideon knew he was going to ask her to marry him. It was just a matter of when. The first snow came in mid-November, a light dusting that melted by afternoon but served as a warning. Winter was coming, and it would not be gentle. Gideon worked even harder, racing against the weather, and Theresa worked beside him, her hands blistered but her determination unwavering. They had over 3 cords stacked now, enough to see her through even the worst winter, but he kept cutting anyway, wanting to leave her with abundance rather than just sufficiency. "You are going to cut down the whole forest," she teased one afternoon, bringing him coffee as he split logs with mechanical efficiency. "Just the parts that need thinning." He paused to drink, savoring the warmth. She had started adding a bit of sugar to his coffee, a luxury she could ill afford, and it touched him every time. "I want you to have more than enough. I want you to be comfortable, not just surviving. Because you care about me." She said it as a statement, not a question, but he heard the vulnerability underneath. "Because I love you." The words came out before he could think better of them, raw and honest. "I know it has only been a few weeks, and I know this is fast, but I love you, Theresa. I think I have loved you since I saw you fall under that firewood and refuse to stay down." Her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too. I was afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or that you would think I was just looking for security. But it is not that. It is you, Gideon. The way you are with me, the way you make me feel seen and valued, the way you listen and work and just exist in the world, I love all of it." He set down his axe and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "Marry me," he said into her hair. "Let me take care of you, not because you need taking care of, but because I want to. Let me build a life with you." "Yes." She was laughing and crying at the same time, her arms locked around his neck. "Yes, Gideon, I will marry you." They stood there in the snow that had started falling again, holding each other as the world turned white around them, and Gideon felt peace settle over him like a benediction. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it, this connection, this love, this sense of belonging to something larger than himself. Theresa was his home now, more than any mountain or cabin could ever be. They married a week later in Wheatland, the small town about 15 miles from her homestead. The preacher was a kind older man who asked no questions about their brief courtship, just smiled benevolently and pronounced them husband and wife. They had no guests and no celebration, just a simple exchange of vows in a plain wooden church, but it felt more meaningful than any grand ceremony could have been. When Gideon kissed his bride, he tasted salt from her happy tears and made a silent promise to spend the rest of his life giving her reasons to cry from joy rather than sorrow. They spent their wedding night at her cabin, which was now their cabin, and Gideon was as gentle with her as he knew how to be. Theresa came to him with a confidence born from experience, but he could sense the nervousness underneath, the fear that this might not be different from what she had known before. He took his time, learning her body with patient attention, finding what made her gasp and sigh and finally cry out his name as pleasure overtook her. Afterward, she lay in his arms with her head on his chest, tracing idle patterns on his skin. "I did not know it could be like that," she admitted softly. "My other husbands, they were not cruel, but they did not care about my pleasure. It was just something that happened. It should never be just something that happens." He kissed the top of her head, anger stirring at the thought of her previous experiences. "You deserve to feel good, Theresa. You deserve to be cherished." "I feel cherished now." She tilted her head to look up at him, her amber eyes soft in the firelight. "Thank you for seeing me, Gideon. For really seeing me." "How could I not? You are extraordinary." They made love again as the fire burned low, and Gideon poured everything he felt into the act, showing her with his body what he could not always express in words. She responded with matching passion, giving herself completely, and when they finally fell asleep tangled together, Gideon knew he had found something he had stopped believing existed. Winter settled in hard after that, bringing heavy snows and temperatures that dropped well below zero. But Gideon had prepared well. The cabin stayed warm thanks to the massive woodpile he had stacked, and they had enough food stored to last through the worst of it. He went out on clear days to check his trap lines and hunt, always bringing back meat that Theresa preserved with the skill of someone who had learned to waste nothing. They worked together to insulate the cabin better, stuffing rags and moss into cracks and hanging blankets over the windows at night to keep in the heat. The chickens survived in their reinforced coop, continuing to lay eggs thanks to Gideon's careful management and the warming bricks he placed in the coop each night. Theresa was delighted every morning to find fresh eggs, and she made them into meals that reminded Gideon of his childhood before the war, when life had been simple and safe. They talked for hours in the long winter evenings, learning each other's histories and dreams. Gideon told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, about a father who had been a blacksmith and a mother who had died young, about siblings scattered now, some dead from the war or disease, others moved away to build their own lives. Theresa told him more about her family in Illinois, about the letters she received occasionally that told of marriages and births and the ordinary tragedies of life. She wrote back when the weather allowed travel to town, telling them about her new husband and the life they were building. "Do you want to visit them someday?" Gideon asked one night as they lay in bed, her back pressed against his chest in the way that had become habitual. "Maybe, but not any time soon." She laced her fingers through his where they rested on her stomach. "This is my home now, our home. I do not need anything else. We could build onto the cabin," he said, the idea forming as he spoke. "Add another room, maybe two, make it bigger, more comfortable, planning ahead." There was a smile in her voice. "Maybe." He pressed a kiss to her shoulder. I thought we might need the space eventually, if we are blessed with children." She rolled over to face him, her expression serious in the moonlight filtering through the window. "I want children with you, Gideon. I want a family, but I also know it might not happen. I was married to Henry for almost 2 years, and we were never blessed. The doctor in town said some women just cannot conceive. Then we will have each other," he said simply. "Children would be wonderful, but they are not why I married you. I married you because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Everything else is just extra." She kissed him then, fierce and grateful, and they made love with the slow intensity that had become their language, saying with their bodies what words could not capture. And if Gideon silently prayed for a child, for the chance to see Theresa round with his baby, well, that was between him and whatever God might be listening. The winter deepened, and they settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Gideon chopped more wood when needed, repaired things around the homestead, and hunted when the weather permitted. Theresa cooked and mended and maintained their home with the fierce pride of someone who had fought for every inch of what she had. They read to each other from the few books she owned, mostly scripture, and a battered copy of Shakespeare that had belonged to her first husband. Gideon discovered he liked hearing her voice recite the old poetry, liked the way she would explain parts she loved and debate the meanings with him. "You are educated," he observed one night after a particularly spirited discussion about Hamlet, "more than you let on." "My father was a teacher, remember?" She smiled slightly. "He made sure all his children could read and write and think critically. Said it was the only wealth he could guarantee us." He was right. Gideon pulled her closer, marveling at the luck that had brought this woman into his life. "You are brilliant, Theresa." "I am practical," she corrected. "There is a difference. You can be both." They celebrated Christmas quietly, with a small evergreen tree that Gideon cut and Theresa decorated with strings of popcorn and dried berries. He had managed to trade some furs for a length of calico fabric, which he wrapped clumsily and presented to her on Christmas morning. Her face lit up when she saw it, and she immediately began planning the dress she would make. In return, she gave him a shirt she had sewn in secret, working on it while he was out on the trap lines. It fit him perfectly, and he could see the love stitched into every seam. "This is the best Christmas I have had since I was a child," Theresa confessed as they sat by the fire that night. "Thank you for giving it to me. Thank you for giving me a reason to celebrate." He meant it. The previous 5 years, he had ignored Christmas entirely, seeing it as just another day in his solitary existence. But with Theresa, everything was different. Everything was better. January brought the worst of the winter storms, burying the cabin under drifts that reached the roof. Gideon had to dig paths to the chicken coop and the woodpile, creating tunnels through snow that was packed hard as ice. They were trapped inside for days at a time, but neither of them minded. The enforced closeness only strengthened their bond, and they found ways to entertain themselves that had nothing to do with going outside. They cooked elaborate meals from their limited supplies, played checkers with pieces Gideon carved from wood, and made love with the comfortable passion of couples who knew each other's bodies well. "I never knew marriage could be like this," Theresa said one afternoon as they lay tangled in bed in no hurry to get up. "Partnership, friendship, desire, all mixed together. Is it everything you hoped for?" He traced patterns on her bare shoulder, memorizing every freckle and curve. "It is everything I did not know to hope for." She kissed his chest, right over his heart. "You have given me so much, Gideon, more than just firewood and security. You have given me joy. You have given me the same." He tilted her face up so he could look into her eyes. "Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. Now I am alive again. Good." She smiled, that radiant expression that still took his breath away. "Because I plan to keep you alive for a very long time." February brought a thaw, the temperatures climbing enough that some of the snow melted and they could venture beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin. Gideon took Theresa up to his old camp, showing her where he had lived for 5 years. It looked stark and lonely in the winter landscape, and he felt a pang of something that might have been nostalgia or might have been relief that he no longer needed it. "Were you happy here?" Theresa asked, looking at the simple lean-to and fire pit. "I do not know if I was happy. I was peaceful. Or I thought I was." He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against the cold. "But it was a false peace, Theresa. It was just absence of pain, not presence of joy. There is a difference. And now I am happy." He kissed her temple. "Now I have joy." They dismantled the camp over the next few days, bringing all his supplies and tools down to the homestead. It felt symbolic, this final merging of their lives, and Gideon knew he was closing a chapter in his life that had needed closing. He would always carry the war with him, would always have nightmares some nights and moments where the past felt more real than the present. But now he had Theresa to anchor him, to remind him that life continued, and that there was still beauty and goodness in the world. March brought the first signs of spring, the snow receding and the creek running high with melt water. Theresa began planning her garden, poring over seed catalogs that had come with the mail when Gideon had made a trip to town. She was determined to have a better yield this year, and she worked with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Gideon helped her turn the soil and build raised beds that would drain better, using skills he had learned from his father. They were working in the garden together one warm afternoon when Theresa suddenly straightened and pressed a hand to her stomach, her face going pale. "What is wrong?" Gideon was beside her instantly, hands hovering, unsure where to touch. "Are you hurt?" "No, I." She looked up at him with wide eyes. "Gideon, I think I might be with child." Time seemed to stop. He stared at her, processing the words, and then a grin split his face. "Truly, I am not certain yet, but my monthly courses are late and I have been feeling ill in the mornings." Her hand trembled where it rested on her stomach. "I was afraid to say anything, afraid to hope, but I think—" He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and protested. "Careful, you will make me sick again. Sorry." He set her down gently but could not stop grinning. "A baby, we are going to have a baby. Maybe." But she was smiling too, hope and joy warring in her expression. "I want to wait a bit longer to be sure. I do not want to celebrate and then be disappointed. Whatever you need." He cradled her face in his hands, thumbs stroking her cheeks. "I love you, Theresa, baby or no baby, I love you. I love you too." She leaned into his touch, her eyes drifting closed. So much. The next few weeks were torture for Gideon, waiting to see if Theresa's suspicions were correct. He watched her carefully, noting the way she tired more easily and how certain smells made her nauseous. She continued to insist they wait before celebrating, but he could see the hope growing in her eyes with each passing day. Finally, more than 2 months after her last monthly course should have come, they made the trip to Wheatland to see the doctor. Dr. Hargrove was an elderly man who had been practicing medicine since before the war. He examined Theresa thoroughly while Gideon paced in the waiting room, his stomach in knots. When they finally emerged, Theresa was crying, and for one horrible moment, Gideon thought the worst. Then he saw she was smiling through the tears and his heart started beating again. "I am pregnant," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "The doctor says I am about 3 months along. We are going to have a baby, Gideon, in early autumn." He pulled her into his arms, not caring that they were in the middle of town or that people were staring. "A baby," he repeated, the words sinking in. We are going to be parents." They celebrated with dinner at the small hotel in town, a rare extravagance, and Gideon could not stop looking at his wife. She glowed with happiness, her face more beautiful than he had ever seen it, and he felt his heart expand with a love so profound, it was almost painful. They talked about names and about how they would need to prepare the cabin and about all the ways their lives were about to change. Gideon vowed silently to be the best father he could be, to protect this child and give them the peaceful childhood he had lost. The pregnancy progressed smoothly over the spring and summer. Theresa's belly grew round and full, and Gideon found himself constantly touching it, marveling at the life growing inside. He could feel the baby kick when he pressed his hand to her stomach, could see the movements sometimes through her dress. He talked to the baby at night when Theresa was asleep, telling stories about the mountains and the war and the incredible woman who was their mother. He added 2 rooms to the cabin that summer, working with frantic energy to get them finished before the baby arrived. One would be the nursery, and the other would be a proper bedroom for him and Theresa, giving them more space. He built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk, and Theresa sewed tiny clothes and blankets from every scrap of fabric she could find. They were nesting, preparing their home for the new arrival, and Gideon had never felt more purposeful. The garden flourished that year, perhaps responding to Theresa's care and attention, or perhaps just blessed with good weather. They harvested vegetables in abundance, more than they could eat, and Theresa preserved everything for the winter to come. She worked tirelessly despite her growing belly, and Gideon had to constantly remind her to rest and take care of herself. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," she would protest, but she would let him help her sit down and put her feet up. "I know, but I worry." He would kneel beside her chair and press a kiss to her belly. "I want you both safe and healthy. We are." She would run her fingers through his hair, the gesture soothing for both of them. "I have never felt better, honestly. It is like my body was just waiting for this." August brought heat that made Theresa uncomfortable, her belly enormous now as she entered the final weeks of pregnancy. The doctor had predicted the baby would come in early September, and Gideon found himself tensing at every small sound she made, afraid labor was starting. He had helped birth calves and foals over the years, but the thought of Theresa going through that filled him with a terror he had not felt even in the worst days of the war. "Women have babies every day," Theresa reminded him when he voiced his fears. "I will be fine. We will be fine. I know. But that does not stop me from worrying." He held her hand, feeling the strength in her grip. "You are everything to me, Theresa, you and this baby if anything happened." "Nothing is going to happen." She squeezed his hand firmly. "I am strong, remember, you said so yourself." Labor started on a clear morning in early September, when the aspens were just beginning to turn gold and the air had that crisp quality that promised autumn. Theresa's water broke while they were having breakfast, and Gideon nearly dropped his coffee cup in his rush to help her. They had planned for this, had talked through what would happen, but all his preparation fled in the face of actually seeing her in the beginning stages of labor. "Go get the doctor," she said calmly, even as she gripped the edge of the table through a contraction. "I will be fine for the few hours it takes you to get to town and back. I am not leaving you alone." The very idea was insane. "Gideon, we have no choice. I need the doctor here, and you are the only one who can get him." She managed a strained smile. "I promise I will not have this baby before you get back. First babies take forever. Ask anyone." He did not want to go, every instinct screaming at him to stay with her, but she was right. So he saddled his horse and rode for Wheatland faster than he had ever ridden before, pushing the animal to its limits. He found Dr. Hargrove in his office, and explained the situation in gasping breaths. The doctor, bless him, did not waste time with questions, just grabbed his bag and his own horse, and they raced back toward the homestead. They made it back in just under 3 hours to find Theresa pacing the cabin, one hand pressed to her lower back and the other cradling her belly. She was clearly in more pain now, but she smiled when she saw them. "Told you I would wait," she said, and then another contraction hit and she doubled over with a groan. Gideon was at her side instantly, supporting her weight. "I am here," he murmured. "I am here and I am not going anywhere." "Good." She breathed through the contraction with impressive control. "Because I am going to need you." The next several hours were the longest of Gideon's life. Labor was hard, brutal work, and watching Theresa suffer through it was agony. He held her hand and wiped her face with cool cloths, and murmured encouragement even as fear clawed at his throat. The doctor was calm and efficient, monitoring her progress and assuring them both that everything was proceeding normally, but Gideon could not shake his terror that something would go wrong. "You are doing so well," he told Theresa as she panted through another contraction. "You are so strong, so brave." "I do not feel brave," she gasped. "I feel like I am being torn apart. You are bringing our child into the world. That is the bravest thing imaginable." He pressed his forehead to hers, willing his strength into her. "I love you so much, Theresa, so much." "Love you too." She gripped his hand hard enough to hurt as another wave of pain hit. "Do not leave me. Never." It was a vow, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The baby finally came as the sun was setting, born with the kind of autumn light that made everything look touched with gold. The first cry split the air, thin and outraged, and Gideon felt tears stream down his face unchecked. The doctor cleaned the baby quickly and then placed the squirming bundle on Theresa's chest, and she looked down at their child with an expression of such profound love that Gideon felt his heart might burst. "A boy," the doctor announced, smiling. "A healthy boy. Congratulations." "A son." Gideon stared at the tiny red face, the flailing fists, the shock of dark hair. "We have a son, Theresa. We do." She was crying too, happy tears streaming down her exhausted face. "Look at him, Gideon. Look at what we made." He reached out with a trembling hand and touched the baby's head, marveling at how soft the skin was, how impossibly small. His son. Their son. A whole new person who was part of both of them and entirely his own. The magnitude of it overwhelmed him, and he sank to his knees beside the bed, pressing his face against Theresa's shoulder and weeping. "Thank you," he choked out. "Thank you for him, for this, for everything. You do not have to thank me." She shifted to free one hand and cupped his face, making him look at her. "We did this together. This is our miracle." They named him James, after Gideon's father, and Henry, after Theresa's second husband. It felt right to honor the past while celebrating the future. James Henry Sutherland entered the world fighting, and continued that trend for the first several weeks, crying with impressive lung power any time he was hungry or wet, or simply wanted attention. Gideon and Theresa stumbled through those early days of parenthood in an exhausted haze, learning as they went, making mistakes and figuring things out together. "I thought I knew what tired was," Gideon said one night as he walked a fussy James around the cabin at 3 in the morning, trying to let Theresa sleep for a few hours. "The war, the mountains, all of it. But this is a whole new level." "At least he cannot shoot at you," Theresa called from the bedroom, and Gideon laughed despite his exhaustion. "There is that. But for all the hard parts, for all the sleepless nights and overwhelming responsibility, Gideon had never been happier. Watching his son grow and change each day was endlessly fascinating. The way James would grip his finger with surprising strength, the tiny sounds he made while sleeping, the way his eyes would track movement and slowly begin to focus. Gideon spent hours just holding him, studying his face, marveling that something so perfect could exist in a world that had shown him so much ugliness. Theresa recovered from the birth with impressive speed, her natural resilience serving her well. By the time James was a month old, she was back to managing the household and helping with the harvest. Gideon worried she was pushing herself too hard, but she insisted she felt good, that staying busy helped her manage the overwhelming nature of new motherhood. "Besides," she said one afternoon as she canned vegetables while James napped in his cradle, "we need to prepare for winter. It will not care that we just had a baby. We are more than prepared." Gideon had spent the summer ensuring they had everything they needed and more. The woodpile was even larger than the previous year, the root cellar was full of preserved food, and he had trapped and smoked enough meat to last them through spring. "You can rest, Theresa. You do not have to work yourself to exhaustion." "I am not exhausted. I am happy." She smiled at him over her shoulder. "This is everything I wanted, Gideon. A home, a husband who loves me, a baby. I spent so long just surviving, and now I am living. Let me enjoy it." He understood that, so he let her work but stayed close, always ready to help or take the baby so she could have a moment to herself. They fell into new rhythms, learning to be parents while maintaining their relationship as husband and wife. It was not always easy, but it was always worth it. Winter came again, the second they would spend together, and this one felt entirely different with James in their lives. The cabin that had seemed cozy before now felt cramped with a baby's needs, but they made it work. Gideon had built a larger bed for them, big enough that Theresa could sleep with James beside her for night feedings, and he had carved toys that the baby was still too young to appreciate but would grow into. Christmas that year was magical in a way Gideon had not experienced since childhood. They woke early to James's cries and spent the morning as a family, exchanging simple gifts and watching the baby react to the decorations with wide-eyed wonder. Theresa had made Gideon a new coat from a hide he had tanned, lined with rabbit fur for warmth. He gave her a music box he had traded 3 prime beaver pelts for, a delicate thing that played a tinkling waltz. When he opened it, Theresa cried and held it to her chest like it was precious as gold. "I have not heard music since I left Illinois," she said through her tears. "I forgot how much I missed it. Dance with me." Gideon stood and held out his hand, and she took it with a watery laugh. They danced in the small space between the furniture, clumsy and slow, with James watching from his cradle with solemn eyes. It was not graceful or elegant, but it was theirs, and Gideon knew he would remember this moment for the rest of his life. His wife in his arms, their son safe and healthy, and the music box playing its tinny waltz while snow fell outside. This was happiness. This was home. James grew through that winter and into the spring, changing so fast that Gideon sometimes felt like he was missing moments, even though he was there for all of them. The baby learned to smile, great gummy grins that lit up his whole face, and then to laugh, a burbling sound that never failed to make both parents dissolve into similar laughter. He was fascinated by everything, watching the world with intense focus that reminded Gideon of Theresa's concentration when she worked. "He is going to be smart like his mother," Gideon said one evening as they watched James carefully examine his own feet with the gravity of a philosopher contemplating existence, "and strong like his father." Theresa leaned against Gideon's shoulder, fitting perfectly under his arm. "The best of both of us. Are you happy?" he asked it sometimes, needing to hear her answer, so happy. She tilted her head to kiss his jaw. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He tightened his arm around her, holding his family close. "You saved me, Theresa, both of you." I did not realize how lost I was until I found you. You saved me first, she reminded him. When you saw me struggling with that firewood and decided to help, that is when everything changed. Best decision I ever made. Spring that year was glorious, with early warmth and plenty of rain that made everything grow lush and green. The garden flourished, the chickens produced prolifically, and Gideon managed to trade for 2 cows, a breeding pair that would hopefully provide them with milk and eventually beef. The homestead was thriving, becoming a real working ranch, and Gideon felt pride in what they were building together. James started teething that summer, which made him cranky and clingy, but even that Gideon found endearing. He carved smooth pieces of wood for the baby to gnaw on, and took turns with Theresa walking him when he could not settle. They were tired constantly, but it was a good tired, the exhaustion of people working toward something meaningful. We should have more, Theresa said one night after they had finally gotten James to sleep. They were lying in bed, her back pressed to his chest in their familiar position. More children, I mean, if we are blessed, how many more? Gideon pressed a kiss to her shoulder, his hand splaying across her flat stomach. As many as come. She covered his hand with hers. I always wanted a large family, and James should have siblings. I do not want him to be alone. Then we will have more. He rolled her toward him, suddenly needing to see her face. As many as you want. Fill this cabin with children and noise and chaos. She laughed and kissed him, and they made love with the quiet intensity of parents who knew they had limited time before their baby woke again. Gideon poured his love for her into every touch, every kiss, still marveling that she was his, that this life was his. That he had gone from isolated and haunted to a husband and father with a family he would die to protect. Theresa became pregnant again that autumn, when James was just over a year old. She suspected almost immediately, recognizing the signs from her first pregnancy, and this time there was no hesitation in celebrating. They told James, even though he was too young to understand, and watched him babble happily in response. You are going to be a big brother, Gideon told his son, lifting him high and making him shriek with laughter. What do you think about that? I think he is more interested in the fact that you are throwing him in the air, Theresa observed dryly, but she was smiling. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with Theresa more nauseous and tired. Gideon took over as much of the household work as he could while still managing the ranch, often carrying James strapped to his back while he worked so Theresa could rest. The baby was walking now, toddling around with determined steps, and he loved being outside with his father. Gideon would talk to him constantly as they worked, explaining what he was doing and pointing out animals and plants. James absorbed it all with serious attention, occasionally babbling responses that Gideon pretended to understand perfectly. You are a good father, Theresa told him one evening as she watched him feed James dinner with patient care. Better than I think you give yourself credit for. I am trying. It was the truth. He thought constantly about how to be better, how to give his son the childhood he deserved. I want him to know he is loved. I want him to grow up feeling safe. He will. He already does. Look at how he is with you. James was indeed completely comfortable with Gideon, babbling happily and making a mess of his food without any fear or hesitation. You are his hero. Gideon's throat tightened with emotion. He is mine too. Both of you are. The second baby came in late spring of 1880, born with less drama than James but still requiring every ounce of strength Theresa possessed. This time Gideon knew what to expect, which somehow made it both easier and harder. Easier because he could help more effectively, harder because he knew exactly how much she was suffering and felt helpless to ease it. But Theresa was a warrior, and she brought their second son into the world with the same determination she brought to everything else. "Another boy," the doctor announced, and Theresa laughed breathlessly. "Of course, we make boys." She looked at the baby with instant adoration. "Look at him, Gideon. Look at our little warrior." This one had lighter hair than James, more like Theresa's dark blonde, and his eyes were that newborn blue that might change or might stay. He was smaller than James had been, but perfectly healthy, wailing his displeasure at the cold world with impressive volume. "What should we name him?" Gideon asked, his finger engulfed in the baby's tiny fist. "Thomas," Theresa said softly, "after my first husband, if that is all right with you." "It is perfect." Gideon understood the need to honor those who had come before, who had helped shape them into the people they had become. "Thomas Sutherland. Welcome, little one." James was fascinated by his baby brother, wanting to touch and hold him constantly. They had to teach him to be gentle, to support the baby's head, but he took to the role of big brother with enthusiasm. Gideon would find him sitting beside the cradle, talking to Thomas in his limited vocabulary, explaining the world as he understood it. It melted something in Gideon every time, seeing his sons together, seeing the family they had created. Life became wonderfully chaotic with two young children. The cabin rang with laughter and crying and the constant noise of little boys growing. Gideon expanded the cabin again, adding yet another room and building a larger kitchen, so Theresa had more space to work. The ranch prospered, with the cattle multiplying and the harvest bringing in more than they needed, allowing them to trade surplus for supplies and small luxuries. Theresa bloomed as a mother, somehow managing to care for two babies while still maintaining the household and helping with the ranch work. She was tireless, and Gideon worried constantly that she was doing too much, but she insisted she had never been happier. "This is what I was meant for," she told him one night after they had finally gotten both boys to sleep. She was exhausted, her hair escaping its pins and dark circles under her eyes, but she was smiling. "Being your wife, their mother, building this life with you. I was just waiting for it, even when I did not know it. I feel the same." He pulled her into his arms, needing to hold her. "You are my everything, Theresa. You and our boys. I would do anything for you. I know, you prove it every day." She looked up at him with those amber eyes that still made his heart skip. "I love you, Gideon Sutherland, more than I can ever say. I love you too." He kissed her slow and deep and felt her melt against him. "Come to bed, you need rest. I need you more." But she let him lead her to their bedroom, let him undress her with gentle hands and make love to her with all the tenderness he possessed. They had stolen these moments less frequently since Thomas was born, both of them too exhausted most nights, but when they came together, it was still magic. Still perfect. The years passed in a blur of seasons and small moments that somehow added up to a life more beautiful than anything Gideon had imagined possible. James grew into a serious, thoughtful child who loved books and learning. Thomas was more adventurous, always climbing things and exploring, keeping his parents constantly on their toes. They had a daughter in 1882. A little girl with Theresa's amber eyes and Gideon's dark hair, and they named her Grace Elizabeth. She was their miracle, Theresa said, the daughter she had always wanted alongside her beloved sons. The homestead became a ranch, prosperous and well known in the area. Gideon hired help during busy seasons, young men who reminded him of himself at that age, looking for purpose and honest work. He paid them fairly and treated them well, and several stayed on long term, building their own cabins on the edges of the property and becoming part of the extended family. Theresa's garden became legendary, producing vegetables in abundance that she preserved and traded. She started a small business selling her canned goods in Wheatland. using the money to buy books for the children and small improvements for the house. Gideon was endlessly proud of her intelligence and capability, and the way she had taken her survival and turned it into thriving. They had another son in 1884, Samuel, and a fifth child, a daughter named Rose, in 1886. The cabin had grown into a proper house by then, with multiple bedrooms and a real dining room where the whole family could gather for meals. It was loud and chaotic and absolutely perfect, filled with the sounds of children laughing and arguing and playing. Gideon sometimes thought back to that October day in 1878, when he had seen Theresa stumble under her load of firewood. How he had made the decision to help, not knowing it would change everything. That simple act of kindness had led to all of this, to the family and life he now cherished above all else. He had thought he was saving her, but she had saved him just as much, pulling him out of his isolation and giving him a reason to live rather than just exist. "What are you thinking about?" Theresa asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, a rare moment of quiet with all 5 children finally asleep. "How lucky I am," he said honestly. "How grateful. We are both lucky." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "We found each other when we both needed it most. Best thing I ever did was chop that firewood for you." He smiled at the memory, at how stubborn she had been, how proud, how beautiful. "Best thing I ever did was let you." She leaned her head on his shoulder with a contented sigh. "Though I fought it at first. You fight everything at first." He kissed the top of her head affectionately. "It is one of the things I love most about you." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, and Gideon felt a peace so profound it was almost painful. This was his life now. Not the war, not the lonely years in the mountains, but this. Family, love, purpose. He had survived the worst of humanity and come out the other side to find the best of it in this woman and their children. "I would not change a single thing," Theresa said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Not the hard parts, not the losses, nothing. Because it all led me here to you, to this." "Neither would I," Gideon agreed. "Not one single thing," and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The mountain man who had once sought only solitude had found something infinitely better. He had found home in a woman who stumbled under heavy firewood, and in helping her, he had saved himself. The wood he had chopped that winter had kept her alive long enough for them to fall in love, and that love had built a life, a family, a legacy that would outlast them both. As the years continued to pass, their children grew strong and capable, each inheriting their parents' best qualities. James became a teacher. His love of learning passed to the next generation. Thomas took over the ranch, expanding it even further with his adventurous spirit, tempered by his father's wisdom. Grace married a good man and had children of her own, daughters and sons who called Gideon and Theresa grandma and grandpa with joyous voices. Samuel became a doctor, determined to help people the way his parents had built their lives on helping each other. And Rose, the youngest, became a writer, documenting the stories of the frontier and ensuring they would not be forgotten. Gideon and Theresa grew old together, their hair going silver, their faces lined with years of laughter and occasional tears. But through it all, their love remained constant, the foundation on which everything else was built. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sunset over the mountains that had once been Gideon's lonely refuge, and marvel at how far they had come. "You remember that first winter?" Theresa would ask sometimes, her voice soft with memory. "Every detail," Gideon would answer, and it was true. He remembered her stubbornness and pride, her amber eyes filled with determination. He remembered the way she had looked at him when he offered to help, suspicious but desperate. He remembered the moment he had decided to ask her to marry him, standing in the snow with wood chips clinging to his clothes. He remembered everything because it was the beginning of everything that mattered. Their grandchildren would gather around and beg for stories, and Gideon and Theresa would oblige, telling tales of the early days, about the war and the hard times after, about homesteading and survival and the day they met, about firewood and stubbornness and love that grew from simple kindness. The children would listen with wide eyes, trying to imagine their strong, capable grandparents as young people struggling to survive. The best things in life often come from the hardest times, Gideon would tell them. Your grandmother taught me that. She survived things that would have broken most people, and she came out stronger for it. And your grandfather taught me that accepting help is not weakness, Theresa would add, smiling at him with the same love that had been there from the beginning. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone care for you. As the years went on and their bodies grew frail, they remained devoted to each other. Gideon would still chop wood, though their sons took over most of the heavy work, because he said it reminded him of how they started. Theresa would still tend her garden, though her daughters did the harder labor, because she said it connected her to the land they had built their life on. And every night, they would lie in bed together, her back pressed to his chest in the position that had been theirs for over 40 years, and whisper "I love you" into the darkness. Gideon passed first, in the spring of 1923, at the age of 78. He died peacefully in his sleep, holding Theresa's hand, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved him deeply. His last words were to his wife, spoken so softly that only she could hear them. "Thank you for letting me help," he whispered. "Thank you for saving me." "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered back, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Thank you for loving me." Theresa followed him 6 months later, unable to exist without her other half. She died in the same bed, in the house they had built together, with her children singing hymns around her. Her last thoughts were of a mountain man who had seen her struggling and decided to help, who had chopped enough firewood to last her through winter and had stayed to share every winter after. She thought of amber sunlight and strong hands, and a love that had sustained her through 5 decades of life. And she smiled, ready to be with him again. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the same mountains that had brought them together. Their children erected a simple stone marker that read, "Gideon and Theresa Sutherland, united by kindness, bound by love, together forever." And the ranch continued, passed down through generations, each one knowing the story of how it all began with a woman who stumbled under heavy firewood, and a man who decided that helping her was more important than his solitude. The legacy they built lasted long after they were gone, not just in land and buildings, but in the values they had instilled in their children: kindness, hard work, the understanding that accepting help is strength, not weakness, the knowledge that love can grow from the simplest acts of compassion, and that family is built one choice at a time. Their great-great-grandchildren would still visit the ranch decades later, would stand on that hill and look at the graves and feel connected to these two people who had loved so deeply and built so much from so little. And if sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the aspens turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke, visitors to the ranch claimed they could feel something special in the air, a sense of abiding love and peace, well, those who knew the story just smiled. Because some loves are strong enough to echo through time, to leave an imprint on the land itself. And the love between Gideon and Theresa Sutherland was exactly that kind of love. The story of the mountain man who saw her stumble and chopped enough wood to last the winter became a legend in Wheatland, Wyoming, told and retold until it took on an almost mythical quality. But for those who knew them, who had been part of their life and witnessed their devotion, it was simply the truth. It was the story of two people who found each other when they needed it most and built something beautiful from kindness, hard work, and love that refused to quit. Years became decades, and the frontier gave way to modern times, but the Sutherland Ranch remained, a testament to what could be built when two people committed to each other, and to the life they were creating. The house was expanded and modernized, but the original cabin was preserved, maintained as a reminder of humble beginnings. The woodpile was still kept full, even though modern heating made it less necessary, because it meant something. It represented survival and love, and the moment everything changed, visitors to the ranch, whether family or strangers passing through, always felt welcomed. It was something Theresa had insisted on during her life, that their home should be a place of hospitality and kindness, just as Gideon had shown her kindness all those years ago. That tradition continued long after she was gone, with the family opening their doors to those in need, offering meals and shelter and assistance without expectation of repayment. It was, they said, what Gideon and Theresa would have wanted. It was honoring their legacy in the most meaningful way possible. The music box Gideon had given Theresa for Christmas in 1879 was passed down through the generations, each recipient understanding its significance. It still played its tinny waltz, though the mechanism was old and temperamental. It sat in a place of honor in the main house, and sometimes, on special occasions, someone would wind it up and let it play while the family gathered. The sound would transport the oldest members back to stories they had been told, to images of Gideon and Theresa dancing in their small cabin while snow fell outside and baby James watched from his cradle. The story, like the music box, was preserved and cherished. It was told at weddings and anniversaries, at family reunions and quiet evenings around the fire. It was adapted slightly over the years, details added or altered in the way of all oral histories, but the core remained the same. A woman alone and struggling, a man who chose to help. Love that grew from that simple act of compassion. A life built together, weathering every storm, raising a family, creating a legacy. And if the details sometimes varied in the telling, if different relatives emphasized different parts, the message was always clear. Love born from kindness endures. Choosing to help someone, even when you do not have to, can change not just their life but yours. The strongest bonds are forged not in grand gestures but in daily choice to show up, to work hard, to care for each other through the mundane and difficult moments that make up a life. The mountains that had sheltered Gideon in his isolation and witnessed the beginning of his relationship with Theresa remained constant, unchanging even as everything around them transformed. The Medicine Bow Range stood eternal, covered in pines and aspens, the same creek running through the valley that had provided water for the homestead all those years ago. New generations of Sutherlands hiked those mountains, some drawn to them the way Gideon had been, finding peace in the wilderness. But unlike their ancestor, they always came home, back to the ranch and the family, understanding that solitude was a gift only when you had connection to balance it. The chicken coop Gideon had repaired and improved all those years ago had been replaced several times over, but there were still chickens scratching in the yard, descendants of the 4 hens and rooster he had brought down from the mountains. The garden still flourished each summer, tended by hands that carried Theresa's blood if not her memories. The barn had been rebuilt and expanded, but it stood in the same spot where Henry Montgomery had built the original, a connection to the past that felt important to maintain. Time marched on as it always does, bringing change and progress. The Wild West became tamed, then mythologized. Wheatland grew from a small frontier town into a proper city. Cars replaced horses, electricity replaced candles and oil lamps, and the world transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable to Gideon and Theresa. But some things remained constant: the land, the mountains, the values they had instilled in their children, and that those children had passed to their own. Every October, when the leaves turned and the first snow threatened, the family would gather at the ranch for what they called the Firewood Festival. It had started as a joke decades ago, but had become a cherished tradition. They would spend a day cutting and stacking wood, more than was really needed now that the house had modern heating, and they would tell the story of Gideon and Theresa. Children would learn to swing an axe under careful supervision. Teens would compete to see who could split logs the fastest, and the adults would work together, talking and laughing and remembering. At the end of the day, they would gather around a bonfire built from the wood they had cut, and the eldest member of the family would stand and toast to Gideon and Theresa. To the mountain man who came down from his isolation to help a struggling woman. To the woman who was brave enough to accept that help and wise enough to see the good man offering it. To the love that grew between them and sustained them through decades of life. To the family they created and the legacy they left. To kindness, the toast would always end. May we honor their memory by showing it freely as they showed each other. And the gathered family would raise their cups and echo, to kindness. And in that moment, on that hill in Wyoming, surrounded by mountains and memories and the tangible legacy of two people who had loved deeply and well, it felt like Gideon and Theresa were still there. Still present in the land they had worked, the house they had built, the family they had raised. Still whispering the truth they had learned and lived, that the best things in life come from choosing to help, to care, to love, even when it would be easier to turn away. Their story was not unique in its elements. Thousands of people had struggled on the frontier. Thousands had found love in unexpected places. Thousands had built lives from nothing but determination and hard work. But it was unique in the way it was remembered, in the way it continued to shape and influence the people who came after. It was unique in how it endured, not just as a story but as a living example of what was possible when two people chose each other every single day. The ranch still stood, more than a century after Gideon had first walked down from his mountain and offered to help. It would stand for generations more, a monument not built of stone but of love and legacy, and the unshakable foundation of two people who had seen the best in each other and built a life worthy of that vision. And that, in the end, was the true measure of their love. Not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet accumulation of days well lived, of children well raised, of a life built together that echoed forward through time. The wind still whispered through the pines on the mountain where Gideon had once lived alone. The creek still ran clear and cold through the valley. The aspen still turned gold each autumn. And the story of the mountain man and the woman who stumbled under her firewood was still told, would always be told, as long as there were Sutherlands to remember and honor the love that had started it all. In the end, that was their true immortality. Not in stone markers or land holdings, but in the hearts and memories of the people they had touched, the family they had created, and the example they had set. They had shown that love could grow in the harshest conditions, that kindness could change lives, that choosing to help someone, to truly see them and care for them, was never wasted effort. And so the legacy continued, generation after generation, each one carrying forward the values and the story. Each one understanding, in their own way, the truth that Gideon and Theresa had learned all those years ago. That we are saved by being seen, by being helped, by being loved. And that the greatest gift we can give another person is to truly see them, to offer help without expectation, to love them not despite their struggles, but because we recognize our own struggles in theirs. The story of the mountain man who saw her stumble and changed both their lives forever was, in the end, a story about the best of what humans could be. And in a world that often seemed determined to show the worst, that story mattered. It would always matter. As long as there was firewood to be chopped and winters to be survived, and people who needed help, the lesson of Gideon and Theresa Sutherland would remain relevant and vital and true.